Hello and welcome to the Snippets of Leadership podcast. You know that bias matters in communication, in leadership, and in life. But if you try to look it up online, chances are you might be getting overwhelmed. Take the Wikipedia entry for cognitive bias, for example. It's got something like 100 different types of bias, and if you're like me, chances are it will get confusing after a while. Instead, what I personally found much more helpful in understanding and overcoming bias is knowing what lies behind it. Once we figure out how we generate bias, it becomes clearer to figure out what we can do about it. So, in this episode, I'd like to share with you how bias comes to be in our heads and a brief strategy to help you understand what bias you may have and how to overcome them. The key reason for which bias exists at all has to do with how we interpret reality, more specifically with how our brain does it. Now, reality is extremely complex, as I'm sure you've already noticed, and if you want to understand and analyze every single detail you can see, chances are that you'll get nothing done apart from looking at things, and you'll get some sort of sensory overload. So, to avoid this sensory overload, our brain has designed quite the strategy. Basically, whenever we see something, our brain asks itself a question first, which is what I'm seeing easy or difficult to understand? If it's easy, that's great. It means that our brain already knows what it's looking at because it's seen it before, or it connects to it. Take a dog, for example. When you see one, you don't need to analyze what that is. It's a dog. You know it. There's no need to put in extra work. If instead it's difficult, it means that our brain needs to put in some more work to understand it. This is, for example, what happens when you're studying something new and your brain needs to process all that information. Now, when our brain thinks something is easy to grasp, it usually means that we're used to it, that we've seen it a number of times, or it's simply displayed clearly. That's the basics of commercials as well. If you see a brand clearly displayed on billboards all around town, you'll understand it and remember it, which, by the way, is exactly what the advertiser wants. Key point here is also that whenever we see something we can easily understand, it also feels effortless. It feels good, it feels right, and it feels true. And our brain really likes to be in this situation versus having to put in more work. It likes it to a point that whenever it sees something difficult, it will also do its best to make it easier to process, connecting it to what it already knows. For example, it will try to connect it to our belief system, point of view, cultural upbringing, or information we acquired recently. For example, if you're traveling in a faraway land where you don't even speak the language and stumble upon a celebration of sorts, your brain will do its absolute best to find some way to explain it based on information it has available and jump to a conclusion about what that celebration is. Of course, what you know and have stored in your memory is completely unrelated to what you're seeing. So it holds zero value when it comes to understanding what that celebration is. But that instinct is so strong that you will be contented with the interpretation you gave yourself and possibly won't even look for more input. That will be extra work and our brain doesn't like it. And that is how we get to bias. We rely on whatever information we can use to easily make sense of what we see and jump to a conclusion on that basis. In other words, we don't judge reality objectively, but subjectively. Out of what we see, we tend to notice only what we like or what we know and jump to our own conclusion. And then, we behave on the basis of that conclusion. And as I'm sure you've figured out, if our conclusion is incorrect, chances are that our behavior also will be incorrect or inappropriate. This also includes how we communicate with others. If we don't have a proper objective understanding of the other person, we'll stumble on bias somewhere while we interact with them. Now, what's fascinating for me here is that to overcome this barrier, all we need to do is hack the mechanism. In other words, if the issue is how our brain relies on information that it already possesses to explain reality, all we need to do is feed our brain pieces of information that will force it to take a more objective perspective. And the best way to do so is telling our brain to watch out for bias in specific situations. And at this point, I'd like to share with you a wonderful resource. It's called Project Implicit of Harvard University. Project Implicit is a series of scientifically proven bias tests. You can take them on their website and they all take anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes. and I encourage you to take them on a regular basis. Mind you, you may not like the results, because you could find out that you are biased in ways that you didn't think you were. I'll share with you the results of 2 of the tests that I've taken to prove this point. First of all, I've found out that I'm basically unbiased when it comes to ethnicity, meaning that I can count that I will treat whoever is in front of me equally, regardless of ethnic traits. Now, I didn't particularly doubt that I would, but it is nice to have an external confirmation about it. What I found, however, is that I am extremely biased in favor of attractive people versus unattractive people. Of course, I'm not happy about it. I don't like hearing that about myself. And you can come up with any excuse, like blaming media or TV in my upbringing, but in the end, that's all they are, excuses. Yet, I am still glad I know this about myself, because it enables me to do something about it. That's the only thing that does. Now, I know that if I'm talking to an attractive or unattractive person, my bias could be at play, and I can inform my brain to put in more effort in this situation. Without it, instead, I'd still assume I'm perfectly unbiased and be none the wiser about how wrong my interpretation of reality and my behaviors could be. So, wrapping it up, whenever we see something that's hard for us to understand, we tend to associate it to what we already know to make sense of it. What we already know, though, may be completely unrelated to what we see, so the conclusion we reach may be incorrect. And if we behave on the basis of an incorrect understanding of reality, we'll stumble into bias. And the best way to overcome your own bias is to know where your starting point is, in what situations you are more likely to be biased, and a great resource to do that is Project Implicit. So if you take a few tests over time and keep loosely attached to this idea, you'll discover a few areas that you're biased in that you may not even have been aware of, and that is the first step in getting rid of it in your everyday life. Thank you for listening. My name is Edoardo Binda Zane from EBZ Coaching. I'm a leadership and communication trainer and consultant, and if you have any questions about what you've heard in this episode, please reach out to me via LinkedIn, Facebook, or my website. I'll be answering the most interesting questions on the show. And if you know someone that will benefit from this type of content, please make sure you recommend this podcast to them. Thank you, and see you next time.